Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Lee, and welcome to The Next Page, the podcast of the UN Geneva Library and Archives. Well, it is definitely no secret that we at the Library and Archives love exploring the subject of multilateralism. After all, at the very heart of multilateralism is all about activating the voices of all. The idea of multilateralism and its capacity to bring the nations of the world together is arguably needed now more than ever. However, standing on the global stage can be intimidating. Within a plethora of voices, opinions, and needs, it can be challenging to take place at the table. In today's episode, we are joined by Ambassador Umej Bhatia, who is the permanent representative of Singapore to the UN in Geneva and the UN in Vienna, among many other roles. Joining us virtually, Ambassador Umej speaks with our director, Francesco Pisano, and gives special insight on multilateralism from the perspective of a small state. Ambassador Umej assures us, though, that Singapore is far from small in its ambitions and its commitment to multilateralism. He speaks on turning vulnerability into opportunity, the relation between multilateralism and globalization, and the bigger picture of macrolateralism and the smaller one of microlateralism. Ambassador Umej also shares about his new book, Our Name is Mutiny, a piece of creative historical nonfiction that explores the Singaporean experience in a very particular time in history, the era between 1907 and 1915. Don't forget, there are more resources linked in the podcast notes, both on Ambassador Umej's book and his work. So, here we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library Archives of UN Geneva. I am extremely lucky today to have with me Ambassador and friend of the library, Umej Bhatia, who is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Singapore to the UN in Geneva and a lot of other places, including the UN in Vienna. He's an extremely busy man, but a friend of our library, and we're so pleased to have you, Umej, on our podcast. First of all, thank you. And secondly, could you introduce yourself to our audience so they know a little bit more about you before we go on the topic of today, which is be at the table or be on the menu, how multilateralism is seen through the eyes of small states. Over to you, Umej.
Well, Francesco, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful podcast. It's a great initiative. And I'm glad you've chosen this topic about, being on the table or being on the menu, because what we can hopefully engage in today is some good food for thought. I have been Singapore's ambassador and permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva for just about a year now. And I'm also the permanent representative for Singapore to the UN in the Vienna office for a year. I'm resident representative to the IAEA and a couple of other roles as well. But I think my most significant job here is I am Singapore's envoy, as it were, to the UN outside of New York. And Geneva and Vienna historically focus very much on the technical issues. Well, we have the Human Rights Commission as well. So there's a very varied scope for us here. I'm also a published author. I'm a historian. And it's something that keeps one part of my brain active when I'm not doing diplomacy. And I'm also the father of two wonderful teenagers. So that's me in a nutshell.
And that's fantastic. And thank you for making reference to both your activity as a historian and writer and also your children that actually are on your official CV. And I was very positively impressed by that, being a father myself. It's time to disclose to our audience, Umej, where the title comes from. Be at the table or be on the menu is actually a quote from Professor Jayakumar, who has been one of the public figures. He still is. He's alive. He's one of the public figures of your country. He's a professor. He's been ambassador. He's been deputy prime minister, minister of foreign affairs. He has covered all the bases. And he had this feeling that small states' foreign policy is dominated by many things. So one among them is this constant vulnerability. And so multilateralism and diplomacy have distinct importance for small states in a different way that doesn't apply to large powers or other countries that do not have the profile of a small states like Singapore. So why don't we start our conversation by talking about what is the value of multilateralism when seen from small states?
Well, I think, Francesco, there's a concept of vulnerability, which you refer to, but we prefer to look at it as opportunity as well. And that's why we say we have to be at the table. We have to make sure that diplomatically we're active, we're not passive. There are limits to power based on your size. But if you make sure that you keep focused on where the action is happening, where the discussions are going on, try to shape diplomatic initiatives, then I think you can make up for your small size. But the fact is that to some extent, we can say size is destiny. To some extent, size is not destiny. We want and need a rules-based multilateral order, and underpinned by centerpiece international organizations like the United Nations. And this has actually just benefited historically big and small states for over 7 decades. Now, there are many imperfections in the multilateral system, and we can talk about them for many hours. We can share all the ideas, go on about all the criticisms, but we are undoubtedly better off because of multilateralism, because of the UN. I think that's quite clear. We haven't had, since the Second World War, another major world war. We've had lots of advances in global health. We've had a tremendous push in terms of standardization in many areas. And so that's why Singapore has been a supporter of multilateralism since our independence 55 years ago. Now, what's so crucial and is taken for granted? Singapore is small. We're not much bigger than Lake Geneva, but sovereign equality, that principle, which is enshrined in the UN, ensures that all countries have an equal voice, technically. Equal voice on issues of global importance. Of course, in some institutions like the UN Security Council, which I served on more than 20 years ago, you have the veto power, and there's a very specific reason for that. But at the same time, for a small state like Singapore, the opportunity to contribute on matters of global interest, the ability to ensure our views, is extremely important. That's why we say we have to be at the table. We try to get in the table, be credible with our ideas, try to essentially contribute something of value on whatever issue there is. And you have to also remember that small states are actually the majority in the United Nations. And I'm happy to talk about, how Singapore has created a forum of small states composed of 108 members, which is the majority of the UN, to help make sure that our interests are represented as well.
I think it will be very interesting to hear more about the forum. Just before we go that, maybe you can link it to the answer to the question I'm about to put to you. And the question is the following. In one of his passages in his book, Professor Jayakumar, that I mentioned before, says, in the UN, when I was there as permanent representative, I found that the odds were stacked severely against small states. Now, you've been in that position before in the UN in New York, and you are in the same position here in Geneva. Do you feel that that sentence written in the 70s is still true today?
Now, I feel it's true today, and it will always be true that if you're a small state, you'll always be at a disadvantage. That's quite clear because you don't necessarily have the resources. You don't necessarily have the networks for a typical small state. And that's why you have to decide, well, do I go it alone? No. If you're a big state, if you're a big power, technically you can afford to go it alone. But just to turn the tables slightly, Francesco, I think today, with today's problems, whether you're big or small, it doesn't matter. You can't go it alone. And we're in a situation today with a pandemic, with problems with the global commons, where you can be a big power, but a unilateral approach to a global problem isn't going to get you out of it. And, even if you take a particular country, if you take the US, if one state in the US had a successful approach to the current pandemic virus, that doesn't matter because at the end of the day, the other states are not dealing with it successfully. What does it matter? So one wealthy state in the US did with it well, and the others didn't. It couldn't carry on business. It couldn't open its borders. And we face the same issue today. So I think there is some truth that the weight's stacked against small states. But that's where small states can come together. That's where Singapore, 1992, in New York, brought together the Forum of Small States. And this Forum of Small States came together with just a couple of ambassadors from small island states. And it was supposed to be an informal, cross-regional grouping to share information, learn from each other's experience, and support each other in candidatures. One of the big issues then, as in now, whenever there's a candidate for UN Secretary General post or UN agency post, normally it is the larger countries that are able to put in their candidates. And this is a matter of social science fact. You can have all sorts of studies that show, and you know as well as I know, that in UN certain agencies are reserved for certain P5 powers, so on and so forth. So again, the small states needed to come together and say, look, please hear our voice, hear our candidates, support each other. And of course, for Singapore, we wanted to make sure that we don't just put forward a small state candidate. We just don't put forward a small state position just for the sake of it. There had to be merit, there had to be substance, and it had to help interests of a rules-based multilateral order at large.
Umej, let's stay for a second longer on multilateralism. When you look at the setup of the international community today, there are several agencies, there are several international organizations working sometimes together, most of the time not really together, on a number of challenges that have undoubtedly become global challenges, affect everyone, cannot be easily solved by any one or small coalition of states. So when you look at it from your observation deck of being a permanent representative, what do you see as a trend in the international cooperation through the UN system? Is this system at large, not the Secretariat alone, serving the purpose better or worse over time when you see it as a permanent representative, as a diplomat? Not so much small state or big state, but there is this constant interaction between domestic interests and domestic agendas and priorities and what we call the global agenda. If you look at Agenda 2030, for example, that's an example of global agenda where the interest is largely the interest of the planet. It's really a global interest to solve things like climate change and poverty eradication, for example. Now, seen from a diplomat, is the system working fine? Are there things that you are perceiving as trends that are upwards or downwards?
Well, I think very broadly, the global multilateral order, as we know it now, right now, has been under pressure for some time. That's quite clear. And some very serious cracks are beginning to show, whether it's the UN, the G20, the G7, multilateral or plurilateral setups. That's a basic fact. But also, the global consensus behind multilateralism and the benefits of a rules-based order, the benefits of globalization have started to wane, have started to weaken seriously in face of forces like rising populism, nationalism, and protectionist sentiments. And the reason for that is because in many countries in the world today, if certain national governments don't deliver the goods, populist movements come in and say, look, we're going to promise you something else. And then they point the finger at international organizations, multilateral organizations, which are very easy bogeyman. Because they say in one lump, you represent global interests and not global interests. So it's an easy political argument to sell, but the reality is far more textured. And I think what is at bottom is rising inequality in societies. And that's one weakness of globalization. Globalization is not able to spread its fruits. So, I mean, something like the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's vision for 2030, that's important. I mean, it's very wide-ranging, but at core, if rising inequalities in societies which are being exacerbated now by COVID-19 are addressed, these populist sentiments, nationalist sentiments, anti-multilateral, anti-globalization only grow. But if these sentiments are allowed to grow, we risk, and right now we're at that cusp, we're at an inflection point of history, and we're at an infection point of history too. We turn our backs on the lessons of history. And what we will end up with, we'll return to a world where might is right, where unilateralism prevails. Whether we like it or not, whatever we do or say, we're going to go through a period that's going to be especially volatile, uncertain and dangerous. That's where we are now. So the issue is, how can we build up some very basic structures of engagement, build up trust? How do we do that? And there are two ways of looking at it. One way is saying, okay, let's bring in more multilateralism. Multilateralism is a very fuzzy topic. And actually, multilateralism, you can divide it into what I call macrolateralism or microlateralism. So what is macrolateralism? Macrolateralism is where multilateralism is that by the big powers. And they say, well, we decide and everyone follows. It's one way of looking at it. If you look at microlateralism, the good examples of smaller states, smaller powers, influences the bigger powers to sort of like follow and emulate these examples and provide some kind of order. Now, the reality is we're going to have a mix of both, but either would work as long as there are countries that come together, cooperate, and begin to have some kind of concerted international cooperation to deal with the current pandemic, to deal with the other tragedies of the commons that the world faces.
Thank you so much for this. I would like to turn to the author, you and the historian. The library has your book, your latest book, and congratulations to you. You just appeared actually from the press, and the title is most attractive. Our Name is Mutiny, by Umej Bhatia. So if our listeners want to go and take a look at that book, I certainly recommend it. And let's look into how you wrote this book on, which is basically the history of the Singaporean experience, which is full of inspiring episodes and tales. So tell us a little bit about the book, also starting perhaps with why you decided to write this book now.
Well, it's a piece of creative nonfiction. And in a nutshell, I look at events that happened more than 100 years ago, between 1907 to 1915. Now, many people think this is a rather obscure era, 1907 to 1915. But actually, it was a heyday of globalization. You could travel around the world without a passport. It was a time when you had empires like the British Empire, you had the Imperial Germany, the Japanese, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You also had the rise of America. You had changing tectonic plates globally. But what was interesting was I looked at how a group of rebels or radicals or revolutionaries based in San Francisco, Indian radicals based in San Francisco, started a movement against the British Empire to topple the British Empire in India. So these were Indian expatriate rebels in San Francisco. And they started this movement to get onto ships and go back to India and topple the British Raj. And this only really worked because during the First World War, which started in 1914, they had the opportunity to jump on these ships while the British were distracted and tried to mount a revolution. On the way to India, from San Francisco through Pacific Ocean to Japan, they stopped over in Singapore and a couple of other places in Southeast Asia. And at that time, Singapore was part of the large British Empire. They said the sun never set in the British Empire. And the British put garrisons of soldiers. But most of their European soldiers were fighting in France, in the trenches of World War I. So they had British Indian garrisons. So these rebels came from San Francisco and they tried to get the Southeast Asian garrisons to rise up. They only succeeded in Singapore. So I tell the story of how that succeeded before they went to India, and then the revolution ended up fizzling out. So one part of the story that's very interesting is that if you actually think about the United Nations, and this story is happening before the League of Nations, before the United Nations, but if you actually think about the United Nations, and to some extent the League of Nations, a large part of what these international organizations were trying to deal with were the problem of, in the case of League of Nations, minority rights, and in the case of United Nations, decolonization, the end of empire, and all these issues. Now, I cover these global issues before you had any international organizations, apart perhaps from the ITU, International Telegraphic Union. And I look at this world And I try to tell a global story of people moving around, forces moving around, powers moving around, but no real international organization. You had empires without international organization. And the story I tell shows kind of collective anarchy when there is no international organization. That's one key sub-theme of that story.
What do you think is left in today's Singapore of these spirits of mutiny that animated the nation in the early days?
Well, I think one key aspect is that vulnerability is still there. People know the story of how the British were defeated by the Japanese in the Second World War. But not many people know that in the First World War, during the Singapore Mutiny, the Japanese were allies of the British and had to, in many ways, Japanese ship and Japanese volunteers, at that time there were many Japanese living in Singapore, helped the British put down this mutiny. So there was that essential vulnerability. And part of the lesson for Singapore today is that if you don't have your own defense, you don't have a strong defense force, if you don't have a united citizenry, if you rely on outside or external defense, you're vulnerable. That's part of the story.
There is another author and ambassador like you I like, and I owe it to you if I got to know him. Is Bilahari Kausikan.
Yes.
And he wrote a fantastic book called Singapore is Not an Island.
Yes.
And in that book, at one point, in one of his chapters, he relates his experience as Singapore representative to the UN in New York. Just before that, he has a forward-looking part of the book in which he wonders whether the future will be multipolar. And I put that question to you. He doubts it, actually. But going back to foreign policy, Singapore, multilateralism, and international cooperation, seen from the observation deck of a small state, when you look towards the future, is the world going to be multilateral and or multipolar? And if so, what is the relative positioning of small states in that projected future?
Well, the world is going to be multipolar. That's quite clear. I mean, poles of power can be seen as, of course, military, economic, political, but essentially at base, no diplomacy can be carried off a barren rock. You need to have a strong economic base to be taken seriously. Now, an example of the US. When the UN was formed, the US had about 40% of the share of global GDP in 1945. Even until 1960, the US still had about 40% of the share of global GDP. Today, that's come down to about 23%. And I think you also have other powers. You have India, you have Russia, you have China, you have Brazil, who all contribute to their share of global GDP. Now, China is, of course, it's got a very strong economy. India is moving along as well. China has a demographic issue. It's a challenge of basically getting rich before it gets old, whereas India has less of a demographic issue. But the bottom line is that if you look 10 years down the road, current pandemic might change things. No country is going to have more than 20% of global share of GDP. Just if you look at demographics, the sheer dynamics of it. So I think the future of the world is going to be multipolar. Now, when you have a multipolar world, of course, some people say you can have a non-polar world, as iron premises, but that doesn't make sense because there are poles of power that are going to determine global issues. Now, in a multipolar world, the question is, are we going to have a multipolar world which is coupled together or decoupled? Today, one of the biggest issues, especially in the US-China relationship, there's a lot of talk about decoupling. There's a lot of talk about separate, trade wars, separate trading systems, separate technologies, the world facing off against each other. And I think the idea that is normally promoted is that there's this dramatic world of face-offs. Now, as I said earlier, the world is going through a very dangerous and uncertain time and period. But the bottom line is that it is still very intertwined. Now, what the pandemic has shown is that you need to diversify your supply chains. That's very clear. Because a single point of weakness, a single point of dependence isn't going to work. That's very clear. And that was true of when the world was scrambling for masks, personal protective equipment, COVID-19. So I think you'll see more diversification supply chain where you no longer have the old logic of just in time. But can the world really decouple? Can we really work separate spheres? I mean, you can use WhatsApp and WeChat. That might be separated, but at the end of the day, we're still using the same technology. I mean, whether it's 5G from this country or 5G from that country, we're still one world. And I think we will still have to converge. We're not going to separate. Now, I think it will be multipolar, but it's going to be a bit more messy and fragmented in time to come without clear definition. We're also going to see a world, I think, which is, in 3-4 years' time, if someone is listening to me, I'm not so sure whether we are all going to be traveling on planes as we did in 2019, the same way, at the drop of a hat. I don't think so. But I think at the same time, it'll be a more messy configuration. But I think the bottom line is that the different poles of power will realize that there's more benefit to cooperation, because the global issues that we face right now, the biggest global issue, the pandemic, when we deal with COVID-19 and we manage to find a vaccine or effective therapeutics, the fact is that the way our system of economic development, of exploitation of natural resources means we have a spillover at another stage. We might be better prepared for it, but we're still going to face for it. So it'll be a multipolar world, and our vision of that, at least for Singapore, in that multipolar world, we're going to try and see what new structures of cooperation we can build. And that's going to be the real challenge, because global interconnectedness is something which no one wants to see cut off. But how do you do it effectively? How do you have a well-functioning system? And that is the key question.
When you look at the narrative and the discussion that was going on just before the pandemic, one of the clear milestones for, when talking about the future was 2030. We were trying to refer many, many things to 2030 and beyond, from here to 2030. And of course, the SDGs are the example of that. But there is also the African Agenda 2063, for example. So do you feel that the pandemic in itself has generated a new way of looking at things, in the way derailed the future that we were imagining, and it's codified in Agenda 2030? Do you think that project is being derailed or prolonged for some reasons, made longer by the pandemic, or made easier? There are some analysts who say that actually Agenda 2030, some of the goals have become easier, better understood, more favored by many more people because of the pandemic. What is your feeling?
Well, I think first and foremost, let's be very clear about Agenda 2030. No one expects the issues of us to have a 2030 world in 2030. It's always aspirational, and it's important. I think, I always say when the ancient Egyptians built their pyramids, what were they for? They were to mobilize, focus the people, and say, look, let's work together towards some structure. And in a way, our Agenda 2030, our SDGs are global pyramids for the world. And they're important pyramids. I think there's so many parts of the world which are crying out for help, which are crying out for solutions. Just look at drinking water, safe drinking water, toilets, some basic issues are still not there. COVID-19 is now the focus for the whole world. Now, before we came up with this, before we faced this problem, not many people were thinking about issues like vaccinating in the developing world. Not many people were thinking about the great work that organizations were doing to make sure that many parts of the low-income countries were getting vaccinated, that children were not dying of preventable diseases. So today, in fact, you're seeing new awareness that if we are going to get a vaccine for COVID-19, it cannot just be done on the basis of one country buying up all the doses. And one of the things that Singapore has pushed, and my Prime Minister talked about at the Global Vaccine Summit in June, was vaccine multilateralism. And we work closely with the WHO, with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, which is the upstream part compared to the downstream part, Gavi, for vaccine. we've been working together on this global COVAX facility. Singapore and Switzerland actually co-chair the so-called Friends of the Facility. And what this Friends of the Facility is doing is trying to shape unprecedented mechanism to make sure that as many countries as possible, whether they're high income, middle income, or lower income, all come together and are vaccinated with a wide portfolio of vaccines of different platforms. So this is something unprecedented. We're designing it right now, and it comes under the rubric of what I call vaccine multilateralism. It's created greater awareness of problems of the developed world and the need to move as one world together towards Agenda 2030.
Thank you for that. I think these points are very powerful, and at the time that we are uncertain about the future so much, I think it's important to continue the discussion on the validity of the SDGs and Agenda 2030. As I like this image of the pyramid, model pyramid for the world. As we draw to a close with this podcast, maybe you want to offer our audience some final thoughts or a key message that you want them to remember, a message from you or a message from Singapore that you want to stick with our audience?
Yeah, I think what I want to say is that for a country like Singapore, our vision of multilateralism is a very simple one. We'd like to see a world where all countries can interact, conduct free trade on the basis of fair competition, focus on building infrastructure, on health and education, on leaving no one behind, on social safety nets. And I think the post-pandemic world is in many ways going to accelerate the pre-existing trends, but it's also an opportunity for us to look afresh at the challenges that we took for granted and try and implant a more positive vision. But I also have to say that, having said that, if we don't take the lesson of COVID-19, so the need for a well-functioning and robust multilateral system is more important than ever, then we'll never take that lesson. And I hope we do.
Before we close, I want to remind our audience that both you and your mission are on social media, and particularly on Twitter. And your handle is at Bhatia Umej, and Bhatia is BHATIA, and your mission is at SGP Mission, and that is SGP Mission GVA. And so there is a wealth of information and hints, and also reference to your book. I would like to recall the title here is Our Name is Mutiny, by Umej Bhatia. Ambassador Bhatia and friend of the library, I thank you so much for taking your time to be with us and with your audience today on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity and really scintillating conversation with you as always. Thanks, Francesco.